Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Rick, for inviting me here. As Rick said, I've been an entrepreneur, but now, seeing you all, now I realize I'm a recovering entrepreneur. I've been fortunate to be around technology for a long time, and in fact, I've drawn on some early experiences to write what would become the first article I ever wrote for Forbes. And I was so excited when this article was published in January of this year. It was about the reinvention of Steve Jobs. And I began the article with this vivid memory that I had 30 years ago at the Boston Computer Society, when Steve Jobs came to introduce the Lisa computer. New England Life Hall was packed. Excitement was in the air. This was Apple's first computer with a graphical user interface. Computer history was being made. Well, I sent the article to Jonathan Rautenberg, the founder of the Boston Computer Society. He emailed me back. He said, "Nice article, but Steve Jobs wasn't there." I'm saying, no, Jonathan, you must be mistaken. I vividly remember Steve Jobs delivering that address. And not only was it my memory, but a well-known journalist by the name of Harry McCracken, who now writes for Time magazine, 5 years ago, he published in a blog that same memory as I had. He was wowed by Steve Jobs too. So I email Harry, I say, "Harry, what's going on? I mean, you know, Jonathan thinks that this didn't happen." 5 minutes later, Harry emails me back. He said, "Jonathan's right. Steve Jobs wasn't there." Apparently, Harry had realized that there was a mistake in the blog 2 years earlier, but never corrected the blog. My first Forbes article is wrong. But it gets better, because guess what the first line of my book was? I was spellbound the first time I heard Steve Jobs speak. 7,500 books at the printer, every one of them wrong. We all struggle sometime. And in a world that's becoming increasingly more complex, growing ever more chaotic and changing ever more rapidly, the job of leadership is getting harder and harder. Just ask Jim McNerney about the Boeing Dreamliner, or Jerry Cahill about Carnival Cruise Lines, or Bill Lynch about what it's like to sell a product that's becoming obsolete at Barnes & Noble, or Ron Johnson, who just got fired at JCPenney. And I'll bet you have had your own struggles as well. The question is, how do we thrive through all that chaos? Over the past several years, I've had conversations with extraordinary leaders in many sectors, in business, government, nonprofit. I asked them to tell me the times when they struggled the most, and through their stories, I pieced together a mosaic of how great leaders navigate through challenge and adversity. I'd like to share with you the Cliff Notes version of that today, and in doing so, begin a new conversation looking at leadership through a new lens. I call it the struggle lens. But to see the struggle lens clearly, we need to remove the shackles that society has placed upon us, because society views struggle as a negative. It's a sign of weakness or incompetence, something to be embarrassed about, ashamed of, or even denied. But we all know that struggle is a natural part of leadership. Dick Schultz said it best when he said, "I don't think that there's been a single year in my 45 years with the company that hasn't been beset with struggle." Now, Dick told me this in 2011. 2012 was a doozy for him. But he also said, with every episode, there's a learning opportunity. And when we transform struggle from the negative that society teaches us into the learning opportunity that we know it is, that's when we begin to see all of the new possibilities. A friend of mine, Joe Badaracco, taught a class at the Harvard Business School looking at leadership through the lens of literature. Instead of the normal case studies, as they normally do at Harvard, they use works of literature like Death of a Salesman, Things Fall Apart, A Man for All Seasons. In doing so, he came up with a 23-word concept of leadership that serves as the foundation of the struggle lens. Leadership is a struggle by flawed human beings to make some important human values real and effective in the world as it is. Now, some of you may immediately resonate to this concept. Others may be skeptical at first, but either way, it begins a conversation about two leadership narratives. First, the traditional lens that we normally look through, represented by the vase. But hidden in this picture are two faces looking at each other, the struggle lens, the human side of leadership. The traditional lens has many advantages. It teaches us all about goals. It teaches us what to do and how to do it. The problem is that this traditional lens sees struggle as a negative, and in doing so perpetuates this myth that there is such a thing as a perfect leader. And so when we face difficulties ourselves, we feel that we're alone. Struggle lens recognizes that we're not alone. No human being is perfect. Struggle has been central to the human condition throughout the ages. It's not a sign of weakness, it's an opportunity for learning and growth. And when we move beyond the what and the how of leadership to ask the most important question, the struggle lens teaches us to ask why. Why are we doing this? What are the values that are most important to you in your leadership? And when we're going 90 miles an hour and blindly in pursuit of those goals, the struggle lens asks us to take a step back, to pause, to breathe, to ask, what are the values underlying those goals? The struggle lens invites a dialogue around this. And so when we move beyond thinking about struggle as some nasty four-letter word into viewing it and embracing it as an art to be mastered, that's when the magic starts happening. Of course, the first step to master any art is to understand the basic elements. In my research of 151 struggle episodes, I found that there are three common elements that were common to every struggle story I heard. First of all, something was changing. Second, there were a set of tensions. And third, those tensions threw the leader off balance. Now, you could be off balance emotionally. You could be angry or depressed or retreat into self-doubt, or you could be off balance physically. Your sleep patterns might be interrupted. One female executive told me that she was so stressed, her hair started falling out. Or the imbalance could be spiritual, a question of purpose and meaning. Or you could be socially off balance, undermining the very relationships that are so important to you. The most important thing is that we often don't know that we are out of balance. So what the struggle lens teaches us is to notice, to pause, to pay attention. And when we do, we can begin to untangle the swirl of tensions around us. We can draw a leadership tension map. In my research, I found 4 tension points that are common in leadership struggle. Tensions of the past, these are tensions of tradition. Tensions dealing with the future, I call them tensions of aspiration. Tensions of relationships are when trust breaks down. And tensions of identity strike when the struggle gets at the core of who we are as a human being. a good way to illustrate this is the story of Joe Dowling. Of course, Joe is the artistic director now of the Guthrie Theater. But the story that he told me was when he became the artistic director of the Abbey Theatre, the National Theatre of Ireland, back in 1978. He was 28 years old. He was the youngest artistic director the Abbey had ever had. Struggle began at the very outset when he realized that he and his board had very different opinions about the very role of the artistic director. Joe saw the role of the artistic director as the captain of the ship, the CEO, the person in charge. The board had a 100-plus year tradition that they were the stewards of the national cultural treasure chest of the country of Ireland. They were the ones who called the shots. The artistic director just executed. And you can see this clash of traditions caused problems from the very start, spilling over to relationship tension. There was never any trust. And then things started falling apart when several years later the Abbey got into financial difficulty. The board issued a mandate: cut costs. Joe, thinking that he was in charge, demanded that the board back down. Of course, the board did not. This caused a crisis within Joe. Non serviam, he said, quoting James Joyce, "I will not serve that which I no longer believe." We see Joe's tension map, a flaming ball of red, high on all 4 points. The real tragedy of this is that Joe didn't see at that time something that would have been obvious to any outside observer. There were two important values here. The board valued financial prudence. That was what was most important to them at that time when the Abbey was in financial difficulty. Joe valued artistic excellence. And had they had a conversation about those two values, they could have reached a solution. In fact, that's what Joe told me when he reflected on the situation 30 years later. He said, "Had I treated them as my colleagues instead of my enemies, we could have worked something out." Unfortunately, that's not what happened. But the good news is not all tension maps look like that. Kathy Tedge's tension map looks very different. When she became the chief merchant of Target back in 2008, when Target was just going through the beginnings of the financial crisis. There was none of the relationship tension or the identity tension that was evident in Joe's case. No, her tension mapped around the change axis. She was just trying to do too much. The world was changing. Every merchandising decision at Target needed to be remade, and at the same time her group needed to think about the store concepts that would propel Target into the future. There was just simply too much to do, and she knew that she had to do it all. The tension map can help untangle and navigate through all this chaotic swirl that's swirling around in struggle. Another way to understand the situation better is to understand what script you're on. In my research, I found 6 scripts in leadership struggle. I'll illustrate just a few today. The stumble, recover, and learn script. That's the most common script in leadership struggle. That was the script that I was on during my book ordeal. 9:35 p.m. that Sunday night in January, my wife is not home. I realize that my article in Forbes is wrong. My book is wrong. I am pacing back and forth in the house. I am all out of balance. I don't know what to do. I'm thinking to myself, my goodness, I've written the book on struggle. I'm supposed to know what to do here. 12, midnight. I convinced myself I need to go to sleep. 1 a.m., I'm still sleepless. It was a sleepless night. 4 a.m., I woke up. I realized what I needed to do. I needed to notify Forbes. I needed to notify my publisher. And it turned out that it wasn't that bad. It turns out Forbes was able to correct the article. It was an online article, and they were able to correct it through a few sentences, which made it factually accurate. And there was good news for my publisher as well. Yeah, the 7,500 books had been printed, but they had not been collated or bound, but were scheduled to be bound that very afternoon. Had I waited just one day later, all of the books would have been bound. Everything would have been done. The entire book launch would have been in jeopardy, and we might be having lunch here without a book. But fortunately, because the books had not been collated, I was able to slip in the change at the very last minute. You can see it in the printed book. Now, Joe's story at the Guthrie illustrates a couple of different scripts. He was on the burnout script at the Abbey. The burnout script begins when our performance is hampered because we don't see the situation clearly enough. Relationships deteriorate. The energy drains from us. We become exhausted. Everyone around us becomes exhausted as well. As the burnout script progresses, we either leave or are fired. But either way, it's not a pleasant experience, leaving very often lasting scars and wounds. I could feel the anguish in Joe's voice as he told me the story that had happened 30 years before. If we recognize the burnout script early enough, we can choose a different script. If we don't, we can choose a different script the next time around. And that's what Joe did when he came to the Guthrie. At the Guthrie, instead of being the self-absorbed leader, the captain of his own ship, he reinvented his leadership to become more inclusive and collaborative. He began to celebrate and appreciate and recognize the contributions of others, moving from the solitary I to the collective and inclusive we. At the Guthrie, Joe channeled his energies adaptively. Not only did he realize his own leadership potential, but through his leadership, he elevated our entire community as well. Through his reinvention, Joe tapped into a quality that I believe is within all of us. I call it adaptive energy. Learning how to cultivate adaptive energy is central to the art of struggle. But it's a skill that requires much practice. Adaptive energy helps you cope with the ever-changing and ever more complex world. It helps you become resilient and pick yourself up when you need to. It helps you become more agile to learn and discover new things. The problem is so often baggage gets in our way. Fears and old tapes keep us from being fully present in the moment. The best way to get rid of the old baggage and channel our energy adaptively is to understand two patterns of human thought. What Danny Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2. I call them the automatic mind and the reflective mind. Each of these two minds has their own unique personality. Let me briefly introduce you. Your automatic mind is fast and associative. It's good for many things, but so often it keeps us locked in old dysfunctional patterns of the past. The automatic mind is overconfident, often ignoring crucial feedback, which it impulsively treats as a threat, as opposed to an opportunity to see the situation anew. The reflective mind is much slower, much more analytical, capable of drawing connections and linkages between cause and effect. It helps us break out of old patterns, but there's one problem. It's lazy. The art of channeling our energy adaptively means training our reflective mind to take control when it needs to. A good example of the dynamics between the automatic mind and the reflective mind come when we look at leadership blind spots. In my research, I found 5 leadership blind spots. Let me illustrate just 2 very briefly today. First, the experience blind spot. That's where our very success in the past gets in the way of our current functioning. You have all been successful entrepreneurs in the past. Now you're moving to a new role. The experience blind spot warns us to pay attention. A good example is Ron Johnson, who was very successful at Apple. He came to JCPenney and he used the same strategies that he used at Apple. Someone asked him, before rolling out a disastrous pricing strategy to all 1,100 JCPenney stores, someone asked him, why don't you test this in a few stores? To which Ron Johnson replied, we didn't test at Apple. The experience blind spot is when our automatic mind is good at seeing the similarities, but it doesn't see the differences. You need your reflective mind to break out of that to see that there are differences as well and create a nuanced understanding of your new situation. Second blind spot I'll share briefly is the conflict blind spot. That's when the automatic mind convinces us that we are definitely in the right and the other person is wrong. Our entire perceptions are distorted around that reality. We need our reflective mind to take a step back, to recognize that the other person is a colleague, a fellow human being who, like we are, is struggling and imperfect, and maybe has some values that are different than the values that we choose to make real and effective. But if we have a conversation about that, maybe we can find some common ground. Struggle Lens teaches us that one way of breaking out of conflict and transcending conflict is through compassion and healing. A good example of this is how the new CEO of Best Buy, Hubert Lee, extended an olive branch to Best Buy founder Dick Schultz. Now, we tend to think of Dick as this larger-than-life individual, but he's a human being just like we all are. You can imagine how embarrassed he was about the Brian Dunn ordeal. You can imagine how hurt he was by the board of directors who forced him to resign from the company that he founded. You can imagine his emotions as he watched the board select a person who he has never met and had absolutely no retail experience. For 3 months, Hubert Lee attempted to meet, and Dick rebuffed his attempts. Finally, when they did meet, Lee treated Dick not as an angry and hostile shareholder who was trying to take over the company, but rather as a fellow human being with respect, bringing honor to his role as the founder of the company. He handed Dick his resume and proceeded to apply again for the job of CEO, even though he had been granted the job of CEO 3 months earlier by the board. Dick would later say that this simple gesture meant so much to him. I give Lee a whole lot of credit here. Yeah, he could have beat his chest. He could have told Dick who was the boss. But instead, looking through the struggle lens, he treated Dick with compassion and empathy, allowing Dick to return to Best Buy with his head held high, bringing closure and healing to this very difficult ordeal. So we now have a framework for the mastery practices in the book. Beginning with the 3 conditions of struggle, we learn to channel our energy adaptively, first by becoming grounded, by centering ourselves, by recognizing that our reflective mind needs to be trained to take control. We draw a tension map and see that there are ways to navigate through the situation by exploring all the pathways that we didn't see before. And as we continue to deepen our adaptive energy, our reflective mind and automatic mind work more gracefully together as a happy couple. It becomes a virtuous cycle. The more adaptive energy you use, the more effective you are as a leader, the more energy you get. More begets more. There are 15 mastery practices in the book. I invite you to delve in. But I'd like to close with an observation that so often our struggles have gifts hidden. In my book ordeal, there were 2. First, the timing. It was truly a blessing that I discovered the error that was latent in the draft of my book for 10 full months, the very day before it would have gotten a whole lot worse. It was truly a miracle. The second gift was the gift of community. Because as I watched the community, my publisher and the community rally in my support during my time of crisis, I realized how blessed I am to be part of a wonderful community. And so I hope for you that you search for and find the gifts in your struggle. And when you see them, it's my hope that you use them wisely. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple of questions or comments or reflections. Yeah. You know, the struggle lens has a lot of opportunities to look not only at the individual level, but the organizational level as well. First of all, we can use the struggle lens as an opportunity for organizational dialogue. This very 23-word statement spurs a conversation that you don't often have on the day-to-day leadership. It gives you an opportunity to take a step back and have a conversation in a respectful way about different values that may be important to different people and may be an opportunity to all get on the same page. So often in a young entrepreneurial organization, when leaders come from different cultures, there are tensions of tradition that are inherent because everybody brings their own team. And now we all have to work together as a family. Well, you know, there are a lot of assumptions that different teams have, and unless you talk about those different traditions, different assumptions, and have a dialogue about that, a respectful dialogue about that, it could turn into a civil war. Another way is to really recognize what are the key leverage points, the pivotal points in leadership development, and begin to train and prepare your leaders to take more responsibility in each and every step of their growth. So those are the 2 opportunities I think that the struggle lens brings to organizations. Yes, hi.
What would you do different to save JCPenney from all bankers?
Fortunately, I don't have that problem. You know, I think a good example of the contrast, and I wrote about this in my Fortune article, which was correct, by the way. Uberio Lee used a very different strategy when he came to Best Buy. He learned the business. Now, that was because he knew he didn't know retail. He wasn't hampered by this experienced blind spot. And he took the time to learn the business. What Ron Johnson didn't do was take the time to learn JCPenney's business. And he would have seen that there were a whole bunch of factors at JCPenney that would have caused him to do something very different. One really good example is that one gift that he was given before he made this most disastrous mistake of his career. Why don't you test this in a few stores? That was a gift. That was a gift. His automatic mind just flew past that. He was so overconfident. The experience blind spot had him, and that was a gift. That was feedback. Had he reflected on the importance of that gift, what he would have realized is that not only is it an opportunity to test the pricing strategy that he envisioned, but 5 other different pricing strategies as well. And then pick the best outcome before rolling out. Yeah, recognizing and embracing the struggle, when you have that lens on, you just see a different approach. Now, specifically what that pricing strategy should be, I don't have the answer. I'm not an expert in that aspect of it. But that's the process you should have used. Yes, other questions? Yes, sir.
What would you suggest to getting someone off of the automatic mind and using the reflective?
Yeah, that is an ongoing process requiring much practice. In the book, I talk about 15 mastery practices. The whole first section of the book, the grounding practices, teach us how to do that. And I just want to call one out in particular. I did mention it in my talk, but I feel it's so important. I call it in the book, center your mind, body, and spirit. You know, when the world is swirling around you, it is so easy to be off balance. And you got to pay attention to the fact that you're off balance and center yourself. Through my research in the book, when I interviewed these people, I discovered the practices that they use. Now, that there are a number of practices that you could use to center yourself. You could do exercise or gardening or being with nature or many other things. But the one that stood out at me was one practice that one of the participants used, and that was the practice of meditation. And you know, if you would have looked at me in my net perceptions days, I was the last person you would have ever thought would be a meditator. But based on this person's experience, it's Karen Jones it's Sandy Jones in the book, I started learning about the practice of meditation. I took a class in mindfulness-based stress reduction and started reading the research. The research shows that in 8 weeks during the class of practicing 30 minutes a day, your brain chemistry changes. Your left prefrontal cortex grows and your amygdala shrinks. Now, of course, the left prefrontal cortex is where positive emotion sits, and your amygdala is where anxiety sits. And scientifically, your brain chemistry changes. But I found experientially it's changed my life. I call it in the book a new operating system for your brain. 8 minutes a day I spend meditating. And when I'm stressed, I really go into a deeper meditation of a half hour. I did that during this book ordeal as everything was swirling around me, and I realized I needed to make some important decisions about the exact rewording of the passages that were wrong. And I had just hours to do that, to make some important changes that I wouldn't be able to sit on. I took a half hour to go into a meditation, because that practice of calming your mind, which is training your reflective mind to become more active, is so powerful. I want to just invite one practice exercise. When you go back to your office and you see your automatic monkey mind swirling around you to make fast decisions, impulsively drawing you to conclusions, I ask you to take a step back. I ask you to breathe. Let your reflective mind take control and envision one new thing that you didn't see when you we're swirling in this anguish. And when you do that, I want you to notice that, and I want you to send yourself a smile, because that's when you'll have taken that first step to channeling your energy more adaptively, your first step to embracing this art of struggle, the first step to training your reflective mind to take control. I would encourage all of you to take that first step. You'll like it. Other questions? Yes?
Is there, in your book, or have you given any thought to potentially creating certain types of conflict to then go through this map and create those gifts and opportunities, or is that, it seems kind of like a bad idea, but
Yeah. Well, you know, first of all, you don't create gifts. Gifts appear to you. You find gifts. But the most important thing in conflict is that we tend to have our automatic mind convincing ourselves that we're in the right and the other person is wrong. And what we really need to do is we really need to take a step back and see the other person as a human being. And have respect for that other person's struggle. Have respect for their situation and treat them as a colleague instead of the enemy. And when you do that, you begin to show respect. And when you create that environment of respect, that's when the gifts start to appear. Now, of course, this is not an ironclad solution. In the book, I talk about one of the scripts, Mission Impossible, when it wasn't meant to be. And sometimes you just need to go back and recognize that. But in conflict, I would always take a step back and recognize that the other person is a human being, just like you are, and show compassion and empathy for their situation. You know, as I've done this myself, I see that the conversation changes. And I actually go back to other conversations that I had before I realized this. I had this new lens, and I realized I would have done them very, very differently. Very different. Yeah, Mimi. Mimi is my writing teacher. I took a class from Mimi 12 years ago. Yeah, thanks, Mimi. Joe Badaracco was actually a classmate of mine at the Harvard Business School, and then later he grew to teach this class of leadership through the lens of literature. And the texts that he used were common texts, like, for example, A Man for All Seasons, or Things Fall Apart, or Death of a Salesman. And through those texts, he saw different things that you normally see when you're looking at it from a business perspective. You know, when I reinterpreted Death of a Salesman through the struggle lens, and actually Joe's interpretation, he talked about the struggle of Willie Loman, and the fact that Willie Loman, and the tragedy of Willie Loman, is he had the wrong dream. And that was his problem. He had the wrong dream. Biff, on the other hand, he saw the world more clearly, and unfortunately, if the two would have had a conversation about the way they see the world, it would have been a very different situation. But yeah, unfortunately, that's what happens in tragedy. You know, I asked Joe Dowling, you'll get a kick out of this, Mimi, because Mimi is a professor who studied Shakespeare a long time ago. And I asked Joe Dowling what was his favorite play that taught us the most about leadership. And he said Julius Caesar. And I actually saw that at the Guthrie. It was a brilliant interpretation several years ago when Julius Caesar was actually portrayed in the modern day Obama White House. And Julius Caesar was Obama. And that reinterpretation of Julius Caesar, the play, which also, when you read Shakespeare's original work, you see that Julius Caesar was interpreted in a way very, very differently than history interprets Julius Caesar. Shakespeare is much more neutral to Julius Caesar and the other characters. And when you see it through a more neutral lens, you begin to see all of the sides that you didn't see. So I interpreted that Julius Caesar through the struggle lens, and also the brilliant adaptation, not changing a single word of Shakespeare, managed to make it work in the Obama first. This is the Obama first administration, not the second.